production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member Renaissance Bank, committed to supporting the growth of businesses in the greater Memphis area. Community banking with local expedited decision-making. Details at renaissancebank.com. Renaissance Bank, member FDIC.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Possible school closings, the county disparity study, and more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by a roundtable of journalists. Toby Sells from the Memphis Flyer. Thank you for being here.
Yes, sir.
Madeline Faber is with the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for being here again. And Bernal Smith is publisher of the new Tri-State Defender. We'll start with the school closings. It's budget season. The school system, since consolidation and even before, but certainly since the new Shelby County school system has existed, Bernal, they've had funding issues. They are looking now at something like an $86 million gap. That's what Dorsey Hobson is saying, the superintendent. They've begun conversations with the board, and they are now beginning to have conversations with the county commission. He's talking about school closings and accelerating. There have been plans to close schools because of schools that are under attended, right. But he's accelerating those plans. He's talking about cuts that would hit the classroom. He's talking about a lot of changes. Your take on that, and we'll go through some of the more specifics.
Yeah, the reality is that there are some significant changes in this economic environment that are going to have to be made to right the ship or right size schools. In a recent conversation with Superintendent Hobson, I mean, we really had some frank conversation about schools that some schools in neighborhoods where they were built for 1,500 students, right. And there's literally 200 students in some of these schools, and it's just going to make economic sense in this environment to find ways to consolidate those schools and classrooms and really make some hard decisions about what we do with the schools, and then, of course, from a neighborhood perspective, what we do with those buildings and those facilities afterwards.
Yeah, two of the schools that are on the list that are run by Shelby County Schools, so the school systems are complicated. The ASD runs some school systems that are charter schools, but two, Carver and Northside, both have about 200 students. They have capacity, as you said, for about 1,200. Right. Normally, Dorsey's been on the show before and talked about, normally closing schools doesn't save a lot of money. True. In this case, it does. It could save many millions of dollars just because those schools are so empty. And you've got to think that it's kind of a miserable experience. Not miserable might be too hard a word, but who wants to be in an empty school? Right. As a student and as a parent.
Exactly. And in some instances, I don't know if we can repurpose those buildings anymore. And so one of the things he talked about doing was actually, if you close them, to actually just tear the buildings down.
Yeah. And the other ones, I'll go ahead and name, he's named 10 that were kind of on a list that they were looking at for the next academic year, but I mentioned Carver and Northside High Schools, Dunbar Elementary, Messick Adult Center, and then 6 charter schools. And this, I think, I don't remember a time when charter schools have been in this number on deck for possible closure, but we've got Memphis Academy of Science and Engineering, KIPP Collegiate High School, Omni Prep, and Southern Avenue Middle School. And again, I should say, it's not that these schools are slated to be closed and they're going down, but this is under discussion to close this gap. I do wonder, though, how much there's negotiations going on. Sure. I guess even Dorsey said these are scenarios, not the absolutes, right?
Right, absolutely. And with some of those charter schools, clearly every dollar that goes to a charter school does not go to the district, right. And so they're really looking at, if these schools are not performing, if they've been given autonomy and they've been given years to sort of build a program that serves our students best, if these schools are years into the process and they're not changing, moving the mark on as far as student academic progress, you got to look seriously at whether it makes sense to continue to allow them to operate.
Yeah, and just a couple last thoughts on this. That last year, the school board used 36 million from its reserves to balance its budget. They still have some reserves, but they would what Hobson said, something effective. I don't want to be the superintendent who bankrupts the school system some years down the road because we burned through all our reserves. So it'll be interesting to see where it comes. They've got huge capital improvement funding issues that have been, deferred maintenance in the, I don't even know.
Right. So some of that still relates to those buildings, deferred maintenance on some of those buildings, which is the reason why they need to close some of them. But ultimately, the county is going to have to jump in and pony up.
Right. Okay. Well, we move on. Obviously, that we'll have some members of the school board and other folks will be covering this issue in the coming weeks and months because it's obviously a big one. We had Dorsey on, I think, about 6 weeks ago. Let's go into the county disparity study and stay at the county commission for a second. They released there was a kerfluffle, as they say, right, about whether they were going to release this study. I didn't understand where that confusion came from.
It made no sense. It's a public document.
Exactly. Right. But there was a huge controversy over it, and then finally Terry Rowland said, he didn't want to be the guy that looked like he wasn't being transparent. So it finally came out, and there was some bad news in there.
But it wasn't. I hate it. On some level, I hate it. There were no surprises. It confirmed what other disparity studies have shown, right? That
exactly.
88%, where are my numbers here, of the 88% of all prime contract dollars from Shelby County government went to white male contractors, 5.8% to African American contractors, 5.1% to white women contractors in a county that is roughly, the city certainly is.
Yeah, the city's 65 and
the county is 50-50 or whatever. So it's been an issue. We did a show on it some weeks ago talking about this disparity. Your thoughts? Sadly, you couldn't have been surprised.
Yeah, no, definitely not surprised. Somewhat surprised at the lack of transparency relative to how the county, the commission essentially wanted to handle the release of the study. And I'm not sure that we've gotten a final 200-page document in its entirety. But at the end of the day, we all know, even based upon the economic census that was released about 2 months ago, that showed that African American businesses receive less than 1% of all business receipts for the entire MSA. And so, those numbers at the county reflect that. The city is about to release their disparity study in June. We know those numbers are going to be equally dismal. This has got to be a real priority issue for leaders, whether they be elected leaders or private sector leaders, in terms of creating some level of equity in terms of playing field and opportunity.
Let me put some numbers to this. The total amount of dollars out there is, I think, 190 million, actually 170 million, I'm sorry. And 11 million to African Americans, almost 10 million, just shy of 10 million to female-owned businesses and non-minority males, so white guys, 170 million, give or take. Yeah, that's right, 170. One interesting thing in it is that African Americans got, the number of contracts they got was relatively high. It was 1,200 versus 6,500, but it was a big number of contracts. They must just be very small dollars.
Very small contracts on general.
Thoughts on this?
I would just say over on the city side, I know that they've got the Minority Business Oversight Commission. They just met on Wednesday. So the city is working on this. The numbers still there are really, really low. And there's a ton of council members that are not happy with that. But they're working on it, I think. So at least on the city side, I believe progress is that they're going to try to make some.
Yeah, I think Mayor Strickland has really put some things in place. He's hired Joanne Massey to sort of head a consolidated Moore and Office of OCC, Office of Contract Compliance. I actually serve on the MBDOC commission, and we're doing some significant work to sort of be an oversight entity to sort of deal with these issues. But we've got tremendous work to do. I think the numbers in the city, the last number we looked at was, particularly for African American businesses, about 8% of total contracts.
One thing that's important to note is that they did do the analysis, and I'm just looking at the summary, which is on MemphisDailyNews.com. I think it might be on the county website also. It's a good question. So, are there the businesses out there to take these contracts? What this study, Independence Day, came up with is that there are of the money the county put out, 26%, give or take a quarter of it, should have gone to African American owned businesses, and only 6% did. So the study did not say, hey, a full 50% of the dollars could have gone to African American owned businesses. They aren't there, but they're getting a fifth of what is possible to
possible,
allow.
right.
I think
Thoughts?
it can be done, but it definitely goes back to intentionality. Like I wrote an article really recently about MLGW's diverse procurement
Right.
processes, and they are knocking it out of the park.
They
I mean, they're hitting like 40% diversity participation, 60% in some sectors, and it comes down to intentionality. It's weave through the infrastructure of the entire business. Every person in every department is focused on getting contracts that go to minority and women-owned businesses.
And you did a profile of Carolyn Hardy. Carolyn Hardy, local business, very successful business owner here, African-American woman, president of the board of the chamber or chairman or whatever the word is, about her efforts to do this. And I mean, she talks about it pretty bluntly, you know?
Yeah, Hardy's position is that we will not move the needle on poverty unless we are intentional,
Right.
you know, and it's not that the public sector is going to lift up poverty. She clearly represents the private sector, being chairman of the board for the chamber.
But that can impact, and it
can
sets an
impact,
example. And
definitely, yeah.
and if your public dollars, if your public institutions aren't spending their money fairly and appropriately, why would businesses follow? Because Strickland's been on the show and said, look, I mean, we need to do this right, we need to change this, but it's not going to lift 100,000 people out of poverty. It's not enough money, but we nonetheless need to do it.
Right, but it really sets the tone. If you look at cities who've done it right, and of course Atlanta's generally, you know, deemed as sort of the entity that really got it right and created that opportunity, you know, under the mantra that, you know, we're the city too busy to hate, and so they open the gates, if you will, for opportunity, and now they have a thriving black business community that really helps to lift the entire, you know, like I say, a rising tide lifts all boats.
We, as we talk about disparity issues, there's a couple things going on with pilots. We always come back to pilots because it's a big political issue. It's a thing that people are frustrated about. If you look at, we do a story on pilots, we'll get comments on it. Same, I'm sure, for the Flyer and the commercial appeal for you all.
Right.
People they have strong feelings. We had Terry Rowland and David Reeves on 2 weeks ago from the county commission, and they exploded about pilots. We'll talk a little bit more Terry Rowland and running for mayor, in part on that platform. But let's talk first about we'll start with some proposals that may come out soon on how, it's always been a question, if you're going to have pilots, how do you require a couple of things? How do you require a wage that's acceptable?
Right.
How do you, can you require that the people who are hired by these pilot-given companies hire locally, and what sort of minority and women-owned business participation there will be, and just how much local contracting will go? It's never, I don't think anyone has said they've ever found the perfect mix, but there's a proposal coming out on the minority and women-owned business side.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there's been sort of a back and forth between the chamber, chamber wanting proposals and them saying that us having some level of diversity program makes us less competitive. And many of us will argue, including myself, that that's just not the case. And as a matter of fact, we couldn't even find one particular company that said, well, your diversity program is too stringent, we're not going to come to Memphis. Mm-hmm. I think that's a ridiculous assertion. I think, at the upcoming board meeting, there is potential, it's not yet on the agenda, but it could be on the agenda that they go ahead and approve a diversity program, which is the one component of EDGE's entire strategic plan that has not yet been approved. It's the one thing that we continue to kind of kick the can down the road, and now it's time to really decide, hey, what is this going to look like?
What is the proposal? Do you know? Can you preview what the proposal will be? Is it because there's been an argument? I mean, it's very complicated, but there's an argument that you can put in steps that you penalize a company if they don't hire an appropriate or a set number. Or you can put in incentives, so it's a carrot versus a stick. So if you hit certain numbers, your abatement goes longer or is deeper, and you save more money.
Right. So the current program, as I understand it, was basically a good faith effort to do 25% of what they call controllable local spend, which is a sort of a real nebulous number that has been hard to define. The new program says, well, we're going to have a combination of both requirement and some incentive. So the baseline requirement would be 15% of construction, which is there's a construction component when a company's building a new facility, and then 15% on an ongoing basis of pilot savings. And then if you meet the threshold, great. If you exceed the threshold by certain percentages, you can increase your pilot savings, but you can a number of pilot years by up to 3 years. If you don't meet those minimum mandates, then there's a potential clawback. Not a check. You don't have to write a check, but there's a potential clawback of pilot years. Maybe up to 2 years, or 20%.
I got you. Your thoughts?
And Bernal, that's right. But what the chamber is proposing isn't that different from what EDGE is proposing, but they're coming at it from two different perspectives. The chamber was originally working on a plan that didn't have any diversity requirements, and then added those kind of back in last minute, but want to put more emphasis on the incentive side, and sort of added back in their diversity requirements as a concession, saying, well, let's look at in a couple years when we see that we're knocking this out of the park, let's just get rid of this silly diversity requirement and focus on the incentive side. And that's not really necessarily EDGE's perspective. I think EDGE just wants to make good public policy, and using tax dollars to support private projects would mean giving back jobs in diverse contracts.
Exactly. Right. Your thought?
The last thing that I would add is just that the diversity program that's in place at EDGE right now, they have an officer there in EDGE that makes sure that these companies stick to this, and it's thorough. They go through the books, they do on-site visits to make sure that that part of the program is in there, and they do a really good job of covering it.
Yeah. There's another proposal, meanwhile, that is, I don't want to say it goes backwards, but it's kind of different from a different perspective. And it's a group of commercial real estate folks, the folks who sell and lease distribution centers and manufacturing space and so on, would like to see more of a fast track, more of a streamlined process for pilots. So that's counter to what some people on the show will say is we want to get rid of pilots, we want more requirements in pilots, we want more accountability in pilots. These guys are saying, guys, men and women, but mostly men, we need to make this faster because we're getting killed by DeSoto County. They are fast, they are, you can talk all you want about how much you hate pilots, but DeSoto County makes it so easy to get tax incentives. Tell us more about that fast track program.
Well, I think the CRE Owners Alliance, the perspective that they have is that, Shelby County is already up against a whole lot of other issues, lack of land, high property taxes, and those are things that are harder to fix. But what we can fix is streamlining our pilot process to make it identical to what happens in North Mississippi. Since we haven't had a speculative building built, and that means something built without a tenant in mind, just build it and they will come, since 2007 or 2008. And since that time, North Mississippi has grown some over 20 million square feet. Yeah. And North Mississippi doesn't give pilots for speculative projects either. We're the same in that regard, but yet they're continuing to grow.
Right.
And North Mississippi's process is much easier. You kind of walk in, $500,000 investment, 15 jobs, you get a pilot. With us, it takes months, lots of lawyer fees, drags on. I mean, we saw everything that happened with the Mall of Memphis pilot, which is sort of what galvanized the Commercial Real Estate Owners Alliance in the first place.
Yeah. Again, Terry Rowland, who declared for mayor this week, this week or last week, I'm sorry, my timing sometimes gets thrown off. He was on the show recently, he's been on the show a couple times as chair of the county commission. I mean, he sees these as pure giveaways, as pure abuse. They need to be ended, I think, is essentially we go to other sort of tax incentives. I mean, we've talked about this as long as we've done the show, of trying to find this balance of how to do these tax incentives that everyone says they don't like, but that every other community, including one right across the border, right across the street,
that's right.
Your neighbor's giving free candy and you're trying to charge for it. Right. How do you compete with that?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's like it or not, that's the game. Yeah. I mean, everybody's playing it, and DeSoto County, they've got an edge on us right now in that, and but in Memphis, we're a lot bigger. There's a lot more voices that need to get in on this thing, so it's going to take some time to vet it, and that's just the end of the thing. But yeah, I mean, it's the game.
Yeah. I think that clearly DeSoto County has some advantages. I mean, they got all the advantages of being right next door to Memphis and all the amenities and access and infrastructure that we have, but they also have a state
Income
tax
yes.
that they use a portion of to incentivize those companies. So they have some tools in the toolbox that we don't have, and I think clearly we have to make some adjustments to make Memphis more attractive versus the speculative stuff, the big land and big land masses and of course the payroll taxes there.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on to the health and the Memphis Health and Education Board. Was halted from doing business. It's an obscure but important board in Memphis. It kind of goes back to some of these issues of oversight. Tell us what's going on. It's a big deal.
Yeah, there are a lot of parties in this, so kind of bear with me. The Memphis Health, Educational, and Housing Facilities Board.
Right.
Yeah, long title.
Yeah.
Sells tax-free debt to support projects that would ostensibly help the public good, affordable housing, education, et cetera. They sold bonds to support Global Ministries Foundation, this nonprofit housing provider that has been blasted for keeping their apartments in terrible, unlivable conditions.
Right. Yeah.
So these projects are not revenue generated. They're supported by rent subsidies from HUD, a federal agency. And these apartments, the Warren and Tulane apartments, failed multiple HUD inspections. So HUD pulled their subsidies. And because subsidies paid for rent, the bonds defaulted. And, there are a lot of questions there. The whole thing is a little bit questionable. But what's especially iffy is that in the period between when HUD pulled their subsidies and before the rating was downgraded, the Memphis Health and Ed Board continued to sell bonds at the original price that didn't reflect,
And I'm reading from your article, at the end of 2015, the board had 28 active bonds worth nearly $245 million out there. They've been around quite some time. I don't know that anyone's casting aspersions on all of the bond issues they've ever done, correct?
Right.
I mean, but there was such a bad, it's really horrific what happened with Global Ministry Foundation and the state of this public housing. It's horrific, first and foremost for the people who live there, but it's a depressing, to put it lightly, use of public dollars that and it's what critics of housing subsidies or any of this kind of safety net programs say. See, they can't do it right. It supports that narrative that the government shouldn't be in that business because here's this abusive, non-performing program of costly subsidies for horrific housing for poor people.
Eric, I think it really sort of explains why the county continued to sort of hem and haw and kind of, give them chance after chance, drag them back in. They wouldn't show up. Sometimes they would show up. And while we have story after story of people living in these horrific conditions, and where you would just think, well, why don't we just stop the money? Say, hey, HUD, look, we need to pull the plug on this deal because these people are just unscrupulous. Yeah. And so when you look at the position of this board that you just mentioned, clearly there was some now incentive where you got to try to kind of hold this thing up because you've put sort of money out there on this.
Just a few minutes left. We should point out that the board has not been, the entity has not been shut down.
No,
it's not under any kind of legal issues.
It issues pilots in addition to bonds.
Yeah, but it's been told by the Tennessee Housing Development Authority
that it can no longer issue bonds.
Go ahead, no longer issue bonds. Stop until we get the lay of the land.
And the current projects are being redirected to EDGE and also to the Shelby County Health and Ed Housing Facilities Board. They're identical but operate very differently, which is a whole other question.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that, and you obviously will continue to cover it. We talk about boards. We talk about a story. You've done a series of stories, Toby, on the Urban Child Institute. Their longtime executive director resigned, some would say in part because of the press they got that started with you. And they have made a whole series of changes, both in staff and in their whole strategy. Talk about that.
Yeah, last year, their longtime executive director, he announced his retirement. Soon after that, the chairman of the board announced that he was going to retire from the board. Saturday, the second in command over there, who was acting as the interim CEO, announced that he was going to retire. And so there's a new chairman over there. And Mary Armour, the CEO of Le Bonheur Children's Hospital, is going to take the reins as acting director until they can find a full-time replacement. And in the midst of that, they're talking about reducing some of the staff over there, and they've also got a new gifting strategy that's going to give away $8 million to Memphis nonprofits that benefit children this year. It's $2 million to University of Memphis, $2 million to University of Tennessee Health Science Center, and $2 million to Le Bonheur, and then the other $2 million is going to go to other smaller charities.
Neighborhood Christian Center, People First, Books from Birth. Am I right about that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of their criticism was that they have a huge nest egg.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the bigger funds in the city. They do all this analysis that everyone agreed was amazing and thorough, that early childhood education, early childhood intervention, all these things that needed to happen to have healthy children grow up and be able to go to school and prosper. They identified the problem, but really didn't use any of that huge amount of money to fund any of the, what people would say, really great programs in Memphis that are
Right.
desperately trying to help those kids that they've identified as at risk.
That's right. And, you know, they used to. Years ago, they were giving a lot of money away. Over the years, they turned that spigot way down, and they were just kind of sitting on the money. And you know, people, after my story, I think the board members got together and said, hey, something's got to change. And they did. And it's been a lot of big, huge changes for Urban Child in just the last couple of months. So it's exciting to watch.
Okay, and we're out of time. Other than we have to announce, people by the time the show airs will know that Tubby Smith is official. We were talking about that just before the show. So Tiger basketball is going to be back, and they're going to win a Final Four in the next 2 years, or we're going to fire Tubby Smith. Okay, no, I'm kidding. But anyway, obviously there'll be interesting and a lot of excitement about that. Upcoming shows, I should mention Jen Andrews from the new head of the Shelby Farms Park and Conservancy. We're going to have Paul Young and certainly be able to talk about global ministry and some of the other housing issues. He is one of the people who replaced Robert Lipscomb. We'll get the Shelby County School Board on soon, I should mention, and Mayor Jim Strickland as we go into city budget season. So a whole lot of good shows coming up. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member Renaissance Bank, committed to supporting the growth of businesses in the greater Memphis area. Community banking with local expedited decision-making. Details at renaissancebank.com. Renaissance Bank, member FDIC.